Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Something's been hiding in the Appalachian Mountains for a very long time. And today, I'm going to tell you 6 true horror stories that'll make your blood run cold. These aren't just campfire tales. These are real encounters from people who went too deep into those dark woods and found things that shouldn't exist. Before we start, hit subscribe and like this video. Share it with your brave friends and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now turn off your lights, because once you hear these stories, you'll never feel safe in the mountains again. Let's begin. My name's Jessica, and I'm 19 years old. I've been working the night shift at Murphy's Gas and Go in Beckley, West Virginia for about 8 months now. It's not exactly my dream job, but the pay's decent enough for someone who's just trying to save up for community college. Plus, working nights means I don't have to deal with the usual daytime crowd, just truckers, shift workers, and the occasional drunk college kid buying energy drinks at 2 a.m. I grew up about 20 minutes outside Beckley, in a little hollow where everyone knows everyone else's business. My family's been in these mountains for generations. Coal miners, mostly, though the work dried up for a lot of folks over the years. My dad works maintenance at the hospital now, and my mom cleans houses for the richer families up in the nicer neighborhoods. They weren't thrilled when I decided to take a gap year instead of going straight to college, but they understood. Money's always been tight, and every little bit helps. The gas station sits right off Route 19, one of those 24-hour places that serves as a lifeline for people traveling through the mountains at odd hours. Murphy, the owner, is this gruff old guy who hired me because I showed up on time for the interview and could work a register without breaking it. Simple enough. Most nights, I just ring up coffee, cigarettes, and gas for people passing through. Sometimes I get the regulars. Nurses, heading home from the hospital, factory workers, starting their shifts, insomniacs who can't sleep and come in for snacks and conversation. The drive home every night takes me through some of the prettiest country in West Virginia, especially along Blackwater Road. It's this winding 2-lane that cuts through old coal mining territory, past abandoned tipples and overgrown rail lines. During the day, you can see the mountains rolling out in every direction, covered in thick forest that turns amazing colors in the fall. At night, though, it's just dark walls of trees on either side, broken up by the occasional trailer or farmhouse with a porch light burning. I'd been taking that route home every single night since I started the job. It saved me about 10 minutes and maybe $2 in gas compared to taking the main highway, which doesn't sound like much, but it adds up when you're doing it 5 nights a week. Plus, I genuinely liked the drive. It was peaceful, gave me time to decompress from dealing with whatever weirdness the night shift had thrown at me. The road has all these familiar landmarks that I'd come to know by heart. There's the old Dockery gas station that's been closed since before I was born, with its vintage pumps still standing like rusted sentries. About 3 miles past that, you hit the Hendricks mine entrance, or what's left of it. The actual mine's been sealed up for decades, but you can still see the old headframe and some equipment they never bothered to haul away. I always use that as my halfway home marker. Once I passed the mine, I knew I had about 15 minutes left until I could collapse into bed. I'd driven past that mine entrance hundreds of times by October of last year. Knew every piece of rusted equipment, every crack in the old concrete. The place had this eerie quality even during the day. Something about the way the shadows fell, maybe, or just knowing that people had died down in those tunnels. But I'd never felt unsafe there. It was just part of the landscape, part of the routine. That Friday night in October started like any other. Busy evening. Lots of people filling up for weekend trips, buying beer and snacks. I was tired by the time Murphy showed up to take over at 3:30 a.m. But it was the good kind of tired. The kind where you know you've earned your paycheck and you're looking forward to sleeping until noon. I climbed into my beat-up Honda Civic, cranked up the classic rock station, and headed home. The night was cool but not cold yet. Perfect weather for driving with the windows cracked to let in some of that crisp mountain air. I remember thinking about how I was going to spend my weekend, maybe drive up to Charleston to see my cousin, maybe just sleep and catch up on some reading. The radio was playing something by Fleetwood Mac when I passed the mine entrance for the first time that night. I glanced at my odometer out of habit, 127,832 miles. The car was getting up there in mileage, but she was still running strong. I'd been saving up to maybe get something newer, but for now the Honda was doing just fine. I was singing along to the music, thinking about whether I wanted to stop for coffee on the way home, when I saw the headlights of another car coming toward me. Nothing unusual about that. People worked all kinds of shifts around here. But as the car got closer, something felt off. The headlights looked older somehow, yellower than modern LED lights, and the shape of the car seemed wrong, like something from an earlier decade. The car passed by before I could get a good look, and I shrugged it off. Plenty of people around here drove older vehicles. New cars were expensive, and if something ran, you kept driving it until it didn't. But then, about 3 minutes later, I saw the mine entrance again. I slowed down, confused. The same headframe, the same rusted equipment, the same cracked concrete pad. Everything exactly as it had been before. But that was impossible. I'd been driving straight, hadn't turned around or taken any side roads. There weren't even any side roads along this stretch of Blackwater Road. I pulled over and checked my odometer. Still 127,832 miles. That didn't make sense. I'd been driving for several minutes, had to have covered at least 2 or 3 miles, but the odometer hadn't moved at all. I tapped the dashboard, thinking maybe the display was frozen, but the numbers didn't change. My GPS showed that I was moving. The little blue dot on my phone was definitely tracking my progress along Blackwater Road. But somehow, the physical landmarks were repeating. The mine entrance that should have been behind me was ahead of me again. I sat there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought, had somehow gotten turned around without realizing it. But I distinctly remembered passing the mine going in the same direction I always did, from west to east. I put the car back in drive and continued on, paying closer attention this time. The road curved and dipped exactly as I remembered it always doing. I passed the same mailboxes, the same driveways, the same stand of dead pine trees that lightning had taken out a couple of years back. Everything was normal, familiar, exactly as it should be. Until I reached the Dockery gas station. The old station had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Broken windows, rusted pumps, weeds growing up through cracks in the concrete. But tonight, it looked different. The building was still obviously old, but the windows weren't broken anymore. The vintage pumps, which I'd always assumed were just decorative relics, actually seemed to be working. There was even a Coca-Cola vending machine humming quietly outside, one of those old-fashioned ones with the glass bottles. I slowed down, staring. Warm yellow lights spilled out through the station's windows, and I could see movement. Inside, shadows of people moving around. But that was impossible. The place had been closed since the 1,980 seconds. Everyone knew that. As I got closer, I saw other cars in the parking lot. A pickup truck that looked like it belonged in the 1,970 seconds, all squared off edges and chrome bumpers. A sedan from maybe the early 90 seconds. And walking between the cars were people in clothes that seemed to come from different time periods entirely. A young man in coal-dusted work clothes was gesturing frantically toward where I'd come from, back toward the mine entrance. His mouth was moving like he was shouting, but I couldn't hear anything through my closed windows and over the sound of my engine and radio. An elderly woman in what looked like a church dress was pointing at something, and when I followed her gaze, I saw she was indicating the digital clock on my dashboard. But the numbers on the clock were wrong. They read 25:73 a.m., which wasn't even a real time. I pulled into the station's parking lot, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, or maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. But as I got closer to the people, I could see their faces more clearly, and they all looked absolutely terrified. The young man in the work clothes ran toward my car, still gesturing frantically. He was young, maybe early 20s, with coal dust ground into his skin and clothes that looked like they came from decades past. He pressed his hands against my passenger side window, his mouth moving urgently, but I still couldn't hear what he was trying to tell me. Other people started approaching my car. The elderly woman, A middle-aged man in a suit that looked like it belonged in the 1990 seconds. A teenage girl wearing clothes that seemed more recent but still somehow out of place. They were all trying to communicate something, pointing back toward the mine, their faces showing a kind of desperate urgency. That's when it hit me. These people, they were all trapped here, just like I was starting to be. Caught in some kind of loop that centered around the mine entrance. Different decades, different time periods, but all of them stuck in this same impossible stretch of road. I rolled down my window and called out, "What's happening? How do I get out of here?" But they couldn't hear me any more than I could hear them. It was like we existed in different layers of the same place, able to see each other, but not truly communicate. I put the car back in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, my heart racing now. Whatever was happening here, I needed to find a way to break out of it. I tried, driving in the opposite direction, back the way I'd come, but the road just led to the same landmarks in reverse order. The mine entrance appeared again, then the gas station, then the mine entrance again. I tried taking my foot off the gas and coasting to a stop, but the car kept moving at exactly the same speed. I tried turning off the engine, but it kept running. The radio kept playing, cycling through songs from different decades. First, a Fleetwood Mac song from the 70 seconds, then something by Nirvana from the 90 seconds, then a current pop song I'd heard earlier that week. The gas gauge was doing something impossible too. Instead of going down as I drove, it was actually increasing. I'd started the night with a quarter tank, but now it read nearly full. Time and distance and physics were all breaking down around me. That's when I saw my own car approaching from the opposite direction. It was definitely my Honda. Same dent in the front bumper from where I'd backed into a fence post last year, same coexist bumper sticker my friend had given me. But the version of me behind the wheel looked different. Younger somehow, wearing different clothes and driving, with a kind of carefree confidence I hadn't felt in months. As our cars passed each other, the other me looked over, and our eyes met for just a second. She looked confused but not frightened yet, like she was just starting to notice that something was wrong but hadn't figured out what. I understood then that the loop was trapping multiple versions of people from different time periods. Not just different people, but different versions of the same people. I was seeing myself from earlier in the year, maybe even earlier in the night. How many times had I driven through here? How many versions of me were caught in this same impossible stretch of road? The other drivers I'd seen at the gas station started making more sense too. They were all people who'd been caught during vulnerable moments, tired from long shifts, distracted by personal problems, emotionally exhausted from life stress. Times when their defenses were down, when they weren't paying close enough attention to realize they'd slipped into something that shouldn't exist. I thought about my grandfather, who'd worked in these mines back in the 50 seconds and 60 seconds. He used to tell stories about the old days, about mine disasters and cave-ins and the men who died deep underground. He always said you had to respect the mountains and the people who'd worked them, that the earth remembered everything and everyone who'd been part of its history. There had been a disaster at the Hendrix mine in 1952. 23 men killed in a collapse that sealed off half the tunnels. Their bodies were never recovered, too dangerous to dig them out, so they just sealed the entrance and declared the mine closed forever. I'd read about it in the local paper's historical archives when I was doing a school project years ago. Maybe that disaster had created some kind of weak spot in reality, a place where time didn't flow the way it was supposed to. And maybe people like me, driving through exhausted and vulnerable, were susceptible to slipping into that temporal crack. I stopped the car at the Dugo mine entrance, despite every instinct screaming at me to keep moving. The other trap drivers had tried to warn me not to stop, their silent gestures frantic with concern. But I had an idea, something my grandfather had taught me about respecting the dead and honoring their sacrifice. I got out of the car and walked toward the sealed mine entrance. The air felt thick and heavy, charged with some kind of electromagnetic energy that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. I could feel presence here, not malevolent, exactly, but desperate, lonely, forgotten. "I remember you," I said aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the still night air. "I honor your sacrifice." I started naming them, the 23 miners who died in the collapse. I'd memorized their names from the memorial plaque that stood outside the local Veterans Hall. James Harrison, Robert Mills, Thomas Kozlov, William Bradley. I recited every single name, speaking clearly into the darkness. As I spoke, I felt the strange energy in the air begin to shift. The overwhelming electromagnetic field that seemed to be holding everything in place started to weaken. The oppressive weight on my chest lifted gradually, and the air began to feel normal again. When I finished the last name, Samuel Rodriguez, age 19, just a year younger than I was now, I felt something like a collective sigh pass through the air around me. A sense of acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. I walked back to my car and got in. The clock on my dashboard now read 3:47 a.m., a normal, possible time. The radio was playing a current song I recognized from earlier that week. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas pedal. And for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt the familiar sensation of actually moving forward through space. The odometer started advancing normally again. 127,833 miles. Then 127,834. Then 127,835. Real progress through real distance. I drove the rest of the way home without incident, arriving at my apartment around 4:15 a.m. My roommate Sarah was still up, studying for an exam, and when she asked how my night had been, I told her I'd gotten stuck behind a slow coal truck for a while. It wasn't exactly a lie. I had been stuck, just not behind anything you could see or explain easily. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe it? But I did start researching the history of the area more thoroughly. I learned about the mining disasters, the families who'd lost everything when the mines closed, the economic devastation that had swept through the region in waves over the decades. I also started taking a different route home from work. It's been over a year now since that night on Blackwater Road. I saved up enough money to start community college, and I'm studying to become a paralegal. I still work part-time, though I switched to day shifts at a different job. I don't drive alone through the mountains at night anymore, if I can help it. Sometimes I think about those other people I saw at the gas station, trapped in their own temporal loops. I wonder if acknowledging the miners' sacrifice freed them too, or if they're still there, trying to warn other late-night travelers about the thin spots. In reality, where exhaustion and sorrow can trap you between one moment and the next. I drive past the Veterans Hall sometimes, just to look at the memorial plaque. All 23 names are still there, weathered but readable. At the bottom, there's a simple inscription. They gave their lives to feed the nation's fires. Let their sacrifice not be forgotten. I don't think I'll ever forget them now. And I don't think I'll ever drive Blackwater Road at night again. Some shortcuts aren't worth the risk, no matter how much time or gas they might save you. Some roads lead places you never intended to go. And some of them don't always lead back. I'm Marcus Thompson, and I've been working as an independent plumber for about 8 years now. Started right out of trade school when I was 23, learned under my dad's old friend who ran a shop in Richmond. Been all over Virginia fixing everything from busted pipes and century-old farmhouses to installing whole systems in new developments. I've crawled through more basements and attics than I care to count, dealt with everything from simple clogs to complete system failures that flooded entire houses. But what happened last spring up in Cedar Ridge changed how I think about my work and about a lot of other things too. It was early April when I got the call. I'd been having a slow month, just small residential jobs here and there. So when this community leader named Brother Samuel called about water pressure issues affecting their entire settlement, I was interested. He explained they were a small religious community up in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. About 200 people, living pretty much off the grid, said they'd been having mysterious problems with their water system and needed someone with experience in complex plumbing networks. The pay was good, really good, and he mentioned they'd put me up in their guest house for however long the job took. After the winter I'd had, dealing with my ex-wife's lawyer and trying to keep my business afloat, the idea of getting out of town for a while sounded perfect. I loaded up my truck with extra tools and headed southwest into the mountains. The drive took about 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote countryside. I'd grown up in Virginia, but I'd never been this far into the Appalachians. The road got narrower and narrower, climbing steadily through thick forests of oak and pine. I started wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere when I finally saw a small wooden sign that said, Cedar Ridge, Private Community. The settlement was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the rough cabins or trailers I'd imagined, I found myself looking at maybe 50 well-maintained homes scattered across a beautiful valley. They were simple but solid-looking houses, most with gardens already showing spring vegetables. Everything looked clean and prosperous, like something out of a magazine about sustainable living. Brother Samuel met me at what looked like the community center, a larger building at the heart of the settlement. He was probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the kind of calm presence you sometimes see in older religious folks. Wore simple clothes but carried himself like someone used to being listened to. He welcomed me like I was family, insisted on showing me around before we even talked about the plumbing problem. The place was impressive. They had workshops, a school, a medical clinic, even a small library. Everyone I met was incredibly friendly, offering to share their lunch or telling me about the crafts they made. Kids were running around, but they were polite and well-behaved in a way you don't see much anymore. The whole place had this peaceful, cooperative feeling that made you want to stay and be part of whatever they had going on. Samuel showed me to the guest house, which was, basically, a small cabin with everything I needed. Clean bed, little kitchenette, even hot water. He said dinner was at 6 in the community hall if I wanted to join them, but no pressure. Then we walked over to look at the water system. That's when things got interesting from a professional standpoint. Samuel explained that their system drew water from a natural spring about a quarter-mile up the mountain, then distributed it through an underground network to every building in the settlement. They'd installed it back in the late 60s when the community was founded, and it had worked fine for decades. But lately, he said, we've been having pressure issues. Some buildings get too much, others not enough. The spring seems fine, but something's not working right in the distribution system. He led me to a small building that housed the main controls. Inside, I found the most sophisticated residential water system I'd ever seen. It wasn't just pipes and pumps. There were pressure sensors, flow regulators, even computerized monitoring equipment that looked like it belonged in a municipal treatment plant. For a community that seemed to live simply, they, sure, had some advanced infrastructure. The readings on the monitors didn't make sense, though. According to the gauges, water was flowing uphill in several sections of the network. That's impossible unless you've got pumps, but I couldn't see any pumping stations on the system diagram. The pressure readings were all over the place too, some showing normal levels, others showing pressures that should have burst the pipes. Samuel must have noticed my confusion. The original installer was a master craftsman, he said. Very innovative approach to hydraulics. Maybe you'll understand it better once you see the whole system. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking the settlement while he showed me access points and explained how the water was distributed. The pipes were mostly buried, but every few hundred yards there were small concrete boxes with valves and connections. Inside, the weird thing was, the more I studied the layout, the less sense it made from an engineering perspective. Water was definitely flowing from buildings at higher elevations to ones lower down, which violated every principle of gravity-fed systems I'd ever learned. But somehow had been working for almost 40 years. I'd never seen anything like it. By dinner time, I was genuinely curious to understand how they'd pulled this off. The meal was in the community hall, and it felt like a big family gathering. Maybe 60 people showed up, all ages, and the food was incredible, all grown and prepared right there in the settlement. Fresh bread, vegetables, meat from animals they raised themselves. What struck me most was how smoothly everything operated. People moved around the dining hall like they'd done this 1,000 times, but more than that, they seemed to anticipate each other's needs. Someone would get up to refill the water pitchers just as they were running low. Conversations flowed naturally from table to table. Kids helped clear dishes without being asked. I sat with Samuel and a few other community leaders. There was Sister Martha, who ran the school, and Brother David, who managed their workshops. They were all curious about my background, my family, what had brought me to plumbing as a profession. but they were also genuinely interested in my opinions about their water system. "We've always been self-sufficient here," Martha explained. "When something needs fixing, we prefer to understand it ourselves rather than just calling in strangers. But this system is beyond our expertise. The original plumber who installed it," David added, "he ended up staying with us, became part of the Bree community. We learned a lot from him before he passed. After dinner, several families invited me to their homes for coffee or to see their workshops. I ended up spending the evening with a family that made furniture, watching the father teach his teenage son how to join wood without nails or screws. They worked together with this quiet efficiency that reminded me of the way my own dad had taught me about pipes and fittings. Walking back to the guest house around 10, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The settlement was completely quiet except for crickets and the distant sound of water flowing somewhere in the darkness. The air was clean and cool, and you could actually see stars without light pollution washing them out. I slept better that night than I had since my divorce was finalized. The next morning, I started my real investigation of the water system. Samuel had given me detailed maps and access codes for all the control boxes, plus permission to dig wherever I needed to trace the pipe runs. I began at the spring itself, hiking up a well-maintained trail through the woods. The spring was unlike anything I'd seen before. It bubbled up from a post-rock formation in a natural bowl, creating a pool about 10 feet across. The water was crystal clear, but it had this faint blue-green tint that made it almost glow in the morning light. When I tested the temperature, it read exactly 72 degrees, which seemed warm for a mountain spring in early April. The intake system was simple enough, a screened pipe that drew water from the deepest part of the pool, connected to the main line that ran down to the settlement. But when I tested the flow rate and pressure, the numbers didn't add up. According to my gauges, water was leaving the spring at a much higher pressure than the elevation difference could account for. I followed the main line down the mountain, checking connections and testing pressures every few hundred yards. The pipe ran straight and true, buried about 3 feet down in a trench that had been carefully excavated and backfilled. Good professional work. But the pressure readings got stranger the farther I went. By the time I reached the first distribution point, the pressure was actually higher than it had been at the spring. That's impossible in a gravity-fed system. Water can't flow uphill, gain pressure without external energy being added somewhere. I spent the whole day mapping the actual flow patterns versus what the blueprints showed. By evening, I had to admit I was stumped. The system worked, the residents had good water pressure in their homes, but it violated basic laws of physics in about 6 different ways. At dinner that night, I mentioned my confusion to Samuel and the others. "The water here has always been special," Martha said with a smile. "When the founders first arrived, they knew immediately that this was where they were meant to build their community. The spring called to them." "Called to them?" I asked. "Spiritually speaking," Samuel explained, "they were seeking a place where they could live simply, in harmony with each other and with nature. When they found the spring, they knew they'd found home." David nodded. "The water nourishes more than just our bodies. It brings us together, helps us understand each other. You'll see what we mean the longer you're here." I wasn't sure what to make of that kind of talk, but I had to admit the community was remarkable. Everyone seemed genuinely happy and peaceful. There was no crime, no conflict, no signs of the kind of problems you usually see when people live in close quarters. Over the next few days, I continued studying the water system while getting to know the residents better. The more time I spent there, the more impressed I became with what they'd built. They grew most of their own food, made their own clothes and furniture, educated their own children. They had a medical clinic staffed by a doctor who joined the community years earlier, and workshops that produced everything from tools to artwork. But it was the people themselves that really got to me. Everyone was so calm and cooperative. Decisions got made without arguments or power struggles. Kids respected their parents and teachers without being afraid of them. Neighbors helped each other without keeping score. I started drinking the spring water regularly. Samuel had mentioned it was much better than anything from bottles or city systems. He was right. It tasted clean and pure, and somehow it made me feel more alert and focused. My usual afternoon energy crash disappeared completely. I slept deeper and woke up more refreshed. By the end of the first week, I was making real progress on understanding the water system, even if I couldn't explain how it worked. I'd identified several places where pipes needed replacement and pressure regulators needed adjustment. More importantly, I was starting to feel like I belonged there. The settlement had a rhythm to it that was incredibly appealing after years of the chaos and stress of running my own business. People worked hard, but they weren't frantically busy. They took time to talk to each other, to enjoy meals together, to appreciate what they'd built. Samuel approached me one evening after dinner with a proposal. "We'd like you to consider staying permanently," he said, "not just to maintain the water system, but to be part of our community. We've been growing steadily, and we need someone with your skills and experience." I was surprised by how tempted I was. Back in Richmond, I was struggling to keep my business afloat, dealing with difficult customers and unpredictable income. Here, I'd have steady work, good people around me, and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. "I'd need to think about it," I said. "I've got obligations back home." "Of course, take all the time you need." But as the days passed, those obligations felt less and less important. My ex-wife had moved on with her life. I didn't have kids. My business was barely breaking even. What was really keeping me tied to that old life? The water system work was fascinating too. The more I studied it, the more I realized it was some kind of masterpiece of engineering that I was just barely beginning to understand. The original installer had been a genius, creating something that worked on principles I'd never encountered before. I found his grave in the community. Cemetery Thomas Mitchell, 1932 to 1987, who joined the Eternal Flow. According to the residents, he'd arrived in 1968 to install the water system and never left. Married a local woman, raised 3 kids, became one of the most respected members of the community. Tom understood that the spring was more than just a source of water, Samuel explained when I asked about him. He designed the system to work with its natural properties, not against them. That's why it's lasted so long and worked so well. "What natural properties?" I asked. Samuel smiled. "Drink more of the water, Marcus. You'll begin to understand why." So I did. I started each day with a full glass of spring water and drank it throughout the day instead of coffee or soda. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. I felt clearer, more focused, more connected to the people around me. I also started noticing things about the community that I'd missed before. The way people seemed to know what each other needed without being asked. How conversations flowed from person to person, like they were sharing thoughts directly. The way children played together without fighting or competition. It was like the whole settlement operated on some kind of shared understanding that went beyond just good communication or social skills. People genuinely seemed to care about each other's well-being as much as their own. 2 weeks into my stay, Samuel took me to a part of the water system I hadn't seen before, a chamber beneath the community center that housed the main filtration and distribution controls. The room was larger than I'd expected, with pipes and valves arranged in complex patterns around walls lined with what looked like natural crystal formations. "This is the heart of the system," he said. Tom designed it to work with the mineral content of the spring water. The crystals were beautiful, pale, blue-green stones that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. When I touched one, I could feel a subtle vibration, like a very low electrical current. The water pipes ran directly through or around many of the formations, and I realized the whole chamber was designed to process the water in some way I didn't understand. "What do they do?" I asked. "They amplify the natural properties of the spring water, help it create the connections between us that make our community possible." I was starting to think Samuel and the others believed the water had some kind of supernatural properties. But looking around the chamber, feeling the subtle energy coming from the crystals, I wasn't so sure they were wrong. That night, I called my business partner, back in Richmond, to check on things. The conversation felt strange and distant. He was telling me about jobs we'd lost, customers who were angry about delays, bills that were overdue. All of it seemed so petty and stressful compared to life in Cedar Ridge. "When are you coming back?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I said. "This job is more complex than I thought." But that wasn't really true. I was starting to think I might not go back at all. Over the following days, I found myself thinking less and less about my old life. The problems that had seemed so urgent just weeks before felt distant and unimportant. My business, my apartment in Richmond, even my family relationships, none of it had the immediacy and meaning of what I was experiencing in Cedar Ridge. The water was part of it, I was sure now. The more I drank, the more connected I felt to the community. Not in some mystical way, but in a very practical sense. I could anticipate what people needed from me, and they seemed to understand what I needed from them. Conversations became easier. Work became more satisfying. Even simple tasks felt purposeful. 3 weeks in, Samuel made his offer official. The community would provide me with a house, a workshop, and everything I needed to live comfortably if I stayed and maintained their water system. They'd also help me expand it. As the community grew, they were planning to add housing for another 100 residents over the next few years. Other two professionals have joined us over the years, he explained. Doctors, teachers, engineers. People who came here for work and realized they'd found something more valuable than a job. I thought about Tom Mitchell, the original plumber who designed this amazing system and then spent the rest of his life as part of the community. Had he felt the same pull I was feeling? The same sense that he'd found where he was meant to be? That evening, I made my decision. I called my business partner and told him to sell my share of the company. I called my landlord and gave notice on my apartment. I contacted my family to let them know I was staying in Cedar Ridge permanently. The conversations were difficult. Everyone thought I was making a mistake, throwing away my life for some religious cult in the mountains. But their concerns felt abstract and irrelevant. I knew what I was doing was right. The community held a celebration for me the night I officially joined. It was like a baptism, but instead of being dunked in a river, I knelt beside the spring itself and drank directly from the source, while Samuel said words about joining the eternal flow. The water tasted different, that time sweeter, more alive. I could feel it spreading through my body, connecting me to every other person in the community in a way that was deeper than words or thoughts. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely at peace. That was 8 years ago. Today, Cedar Ridge has grown to almost 400 residents. I've overseen the installation of water systems in 3 neighboring settlements that follow our model. My workshop produces the specialized components needed to work with spring water's unique properties. People ask me sometimes if I miss my old life. I honestly can't remember why I ever thought it was worth preserving. The stress, the loneliness, the constant struggle for money and status, all of it seems meaningless now. Here, I'm part of something larger than myself. The water connects us all in ways that outsiders can't understand. We share our joys and sorrows, our work and rest, our very thoughts and dreams. There's no conflict because there's no separation between us. Sometimes, new people arrive, professionals like I was, called here to solve some problem with our systems. Most leave after finishing their work. But some stay. They drink the water, feel the connection, realize they've found home. We're always growing, always welcoming new members to our community. The spring provides everything we need, and we provide everything each other needs. It's a perfect system, sustainable and peaceful. I've never been happier. None of us have. My name's Mike, and I'm 28 now, working third shift at a packaging plant outside Louisville. But back when I was 26, I was running the line at Henderson Manufacturing, pulling decent money and living for my time off. Me and my 3 best friends from high school, Brad, Chris, and Danny, we'd been hunting together every November for 8 years straight. It was our thing, you know? The 1 week each year where we could get away from our jobs, our girlfriends, all the bullshit, and just be out in the woods like we used to when we were kids. We all grew up in eastern Kentucky, in families where hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was how you put meat on the table. My granddad taught me to shoot when I was 7, and by the time I was 12, I could track a deer through thick brush and drop it clean with a bow at 40 yards. Brad, Chris, and Danny were the same way. We'd learned from our fathers and grandfathers, men who'd been hunting these mountains since before there were proper roads or GPS units. When we went hunting, we took it seriously. This wasn't some weekend warrior bullshit. We were going to bring home venison for our families. That November, we'd reserved a cabin through the Kentucky State Park Service up at Copper Mountain Wildlife Area. It wasn't fancy, just 4 bunks, a wood stove, and a hand pump for water, but it was legal, permitted, and right in the heart of some of the best bow hunting territory in the state. We'd each drawn tags for the archery season, and the weather forecast was perfect. Cold nights, clear days, with that crisp November air that gets the deer moving during rutting season. The drive up took about 3 hours from where we all lived, winding through narrow mountain roads that got progressively more remote as we climbed elevation. Cell service cut out completely, about 20 miles from the cabin, but that was normal for this part of Kentucky. The mountains are old here, older than the Rockies, and they swallow up radio signals like they're nothing. Brad worked the night shift loading trucks at a warehouse, so he was used to weird hours. Chris had been doing farm work since he graduated, hay, tobacco, cattle, whatever needed doing, and he was tough as nails. Danny drove long haul for a freight company, knew how to handle himself in strange places. And me, I'd been working factory jobs since I was 18, knew how to keep my head when things got stressful. We weren't soft city guys playing at being outdoorsmen. We knew what we were doing. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 2 miles off the main forest road, accessible only by a dirt track that required 4-wheel drive. The nearest neighbor was probably 15 miles away, and the nearest town was Hazard, population maybe 5,000 on a good day. This was genuine backcountry, the kind of place where you could walk for hours and never see another human being. We arrived on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November. The trees were mostly bare by then, which was good for bow hunting. You need clear sight lines when you're limited to 30-yard shots. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of brown and orange leaves that crunched under our boots as we unloaded our gear. The air smelled like wood smoke and damp earth, with that particular metallic scent you get in the mountains when winter's coming. Our first order of business was always scouting. We'd spent money on this trip, gas, permits, cabin rental, time off work, and we wanted to make sure we found the deer before we started hunting. Monday morning, we split up to cover more ground, each taking a different ridge to look for sign. Deer trails, rubs on trees where bucks had scraped their antlers, scrapes in the dirt where they'd marked territory during the rut. I found good sign about half a mile east of the cabin. Fresh tracks in the mud near a creek, several rubs on young maples that looked maybe a day old. Chris came back with news of a well-used trail that crossed a saddle between 2 ridges about a mile north. Danny had found what looked like a bedding area in a stand of pine trees, with flattened grass and fresh droppings. Brad reported deer movement in a hollow to the west, where white oaks were dropping acorns. Tuesday morning, we set up our tree stands in different locations and settled in for the real hunting. By noon, both Danny and Chris had scored. Danny dropped a nice 8-point buck at about 25 yards, and Chris took a smaller buck, but still a clean shot through both lungs. We spent Tuesday afternoon field dressing the deer and getting them hung up to cool in the shade behind the cabin. That evening, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. 2 deer down on the first real day of hunting, both clean kills, both good eating. We were sitting around the wood stove, drinking beer and talking about where to hunt Wednesday when we heard a vehicle coming up the dirt road. It was a Kentucky Fish and Wildlife truck, and the ranger who got out was a guy, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face you get from spending 20 years outdoors in all kinds of weather. His name tag said Patterson, and he seemed friendly enough. But there was something in his eyes that made me pay attention. "Evening, boys," he said. "They're looking over our hung deer and our equipment. Looks like you're having some success." "Yes, sir," Chris said. "Both legal, both tagged, both taken during legal hunting hours." Patterson nodded, checking our licenses and tags. Everything was in order. But instead of leaving after the check, he hung around, looking uncomfortable. "You boys planning on hunting up on the ridge tomorrow?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward the higher elevations to the east. "We were thinking about it," Brad said. "Why?" Patterson was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how much to say. Finally, "Well, it's good hunting up there, real good, but you need to be careful. Stay together, keep your radios on, and if something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts and get out." "What kind of something?" Danny asked. "Just unusual wildlife behavior. We've had some experienced hunters report things that don't quite add up. And last year, We had 3 hunters go missing up on Copper Mountain Ridge. Never found them. Officially, we think they fell into old mine shafts. There's a lot of abandoned coal mining up there from the 1920s and 30 seconds. But unofficially? I asked. Patterson looked at me for a long moment. Unofficially, I've been working these mountains for 23 years, and I've never seen experienced hunters just disappear like that. These weren't weekend warriors. They knew what they were doing, and they knew these mountains. He gave us his card and told us to check in with him by radio every few hours if we decided to hunt the ridge. After he left, we sat around the fire for another hour, talking about what he'd said. Old mines, Chris said. That makes sense. You step through rotted boards over a 100-foot shaft, you're gone. Yeah, but why didn't they find the bodies? Brad asked. You fall down a mine shaft, there's going to be evidence. Maybe they did fall, and animals got to them, Danny suggested. I didn't say anything, but something about Patterson's manner had bothered me. He wasn't just giving us a standard safety warning. He was genuinely worried about something specific, and whatever it was, it had him spooked enough that he'd driven up here after dark to warn us. Wednesday morning, we decided to hunt the ridge anyway. We'd been planning this trip for months, we had limited time off, work, and we weren't going to let some vague warnings keep us from the best hunting territory in the area. But we took precautions. We packed emergency supplies, extra batteries for our radios, GPS units, and agreed to check in with each other every 30 minutes. The hike up to Copper Mountain Ridge took about an hour, climbing steadily through thick hardwood forest. The higher we got, the more deer sign we found. This was clearly prime territory. By the time we reached the ridge, we were finding fresh tracks, rubs, and scrapes everywhere we looked. We set up our tree stands about 300 yards apart along the ridge. Far enough to avoid interfering with each other's shots, but close enough to maintain radio contact. I was positioned on the eastern end, overlooking a saddle between 2 peaks where a well-used deer trail crossed from north to south. The first thing I noticed was the silence. In good hunting territory, you expect to hear birds, squirrels, the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals move through the underbrush. But here, 20 feet up in my tree stand, I could hear nothing but wind through the bare branches. The second thing I noticed were the claw marks on the tree I was sitting in. They were about 8 feet off the ground, too high for a bear to make standing on its hind legs, and they were deep. Whoever or whatever had made them had serious strength. But they weren't random scratches. They looked deliberate, almost like territorial markings. Anyone else noticing weird stuff over here? I radioed to the others at our first 30-minute check-in. Like what? Chris's voice came back, slightly distorted by static. Claw marks on my tree. Big ones, up high, and it's dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Now that you mention it, Danny's voice. I found some deer, remains about 50 yards from my stand. But they're, I don't know, arranged funny, like someone laid them out in a pattern. What kind of pattern? Brad asked. Hard to explain. The bones are clean, but they're lined up in rows. Ribs here, leg bones there, skull in the middle. Doesn't look like normal predator behavior. Brad's voice came over the radio. I'm looking at what appears to be a hunting blind, but it's not on any of the park maps. Looks old, but well maintained. Built into the rocks, really hard to spot, unless you're looking for it. That got my attention. Unauthorized hunting blinds usually meant poachers, and poachers in remote areas could be dangerous if they thought you might report them. How old? I asked. Hard to say. The construction looks, I don't know, primitive, like it was built with hand tools, no power equipment. But the wood isn't rotted, the camouflage is still good. Someone's been maintaining it. We decided to regroup at midday to compare notes and decide whether to keep hunting or head back down the mountain. When we met at my position, Danny showed us photos on his digital camera of the deer remains he'd found. Even in the low-resolution display, it was clear that what he'd discovered wasn't normal predator kill. The bones were stripped completely clean, but they weren't scattered the way they would be if coyotes or bears had been feeding. They were arranged in precise lines, like someone had deliberately laid them out for display. The skull was positioned at what looked like the head of the arrangement, facing east toward the rising sun. Brad led us to the hunting blind he'd discovered. It was built into a natural rock formation, so well concealed that we walked past it twice before he pointed it out. The construction was sophisticated. Whoever had built it understood sightlines, wind direction, and camouflage. But like Brad had said, it looked old-fashioned, built entirely with hand tools. "Check this out," Chris said, pointing to marks carved into the rock beside the blind. They looked like tally marks, groups of 5 lines with a diagonal line through each group. There were maybe 40 or 50 marks total. "Counting kills?" Danny suggested. "That's a lot of deer for one season," I said. "Maybe. It's not deer they're counting." That was when Chris showed us what he'd found on his trail camera. He'd set it up Tuesday evening to monitor a game trail, but when he checked the memory card Wednesday morning, most of the photos weren't deer. The images were time-stamped throughout Tuesday night, starting around 10 p.m. and continuing until dawn. The first few showed normal nocturnal activity, a raccoon, an opossum, a couple of does moving through in the early morning. But starting around midnight, the camera had captured something else. Tall figures moving through the frame, bipedal but covered in dark fur or hair. In the low-resolution infrared images, details were hard to make out, but their behavior was clearly intelligent. They moved with purpose, not like animals wandering randomly through the forest. And they were clearly aware of the camera. In several shots, they appeared to be examining it, testing the motion sensor, figuring out how it worked. "Sasquatch," Danny said, half joking. "I don't know what the hell that is," Chris said, "but look at this one." In the clearest photo, one of the figures was holding what looked like a stick or primitive tool. Its posture was upright, human-like, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long, shoulders too broad. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Hang on," Brad said. "This could be some kind of elaborate hoax. Maybe local guys trying to scare hunters away from their favorite spots." "With what? Movie-quality costumes?" Chris said. "Look at these images. The movement looks natural, not like guys in suits." We spent another hour debating what to do. The logical part of my brain agreed with Brad. The photos could be faked, the bone arrangement could be someone's idea of a prank, the hunting blind could belong to local poachers who wanted to scare off competition. But my gut was telling me something different. The silence in the forest, the claw marks on my tree, the way Patterson had acted the night before, it all added up to something genuinely wrong. In the end, we decided to hunt together for the rest of the day instead of splitting up. We moved our tree stands closer together and maintained constant radio contact. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that we weren't the only hunters on Copper Mountain Ridge. Around 2 p.m., I started noticing movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind, shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. At first, I thought it was just my nerves, but when I mentioned it on the radio, the others confirmed they were seeing similar things. "Whatever's out there, it's keeping pace with us," Danny said. "Every time I move to a new position, I see movement about 100 yards away, moving parallel." "Same here," Brad confirmed. "It's like we're being tracked." "By what?" "I don't know, but it's coordinated. This isn't random animal behavior." Around 3 p.m., Brad's radio went dead. We tried raising him for 10 minutes with no response. Then Chris and Danny hiked over to his last known position, while I stayed put to coordinate from my higher vantage point. They found his bow and backpack at the base of his tree stand, but no Brad. There was blood on the leaves. Not a lot, but enough to suggest injury. The trail led east toward a steep rock face, but it wasn't a normal human trail. The spacing between footprints was wrong, too long for someone Brad's height. And there were other prints alongside his. Bare feet, but larger than human feet, with what looked like claws. "Mike, you need to see this." Chris's voice was tight with fear. Following the trail, they'd found Brad's body displayed on a narrow ledge about 20 feet up the rock face. I won't go into details about his condition, but it was clear that whatever had killed him had done it deliberately. As a warning, the wounds were precise, targeting vital organs while leaving his hunting equipment undamaged. We got off the mountain as fast as we could, abandoning our gear and using our GPS units to navigate in the dark. But we could hear them following us. Multiple individuals moving through the forest parallel to our route, occasionally calling to each other in voices that weren't quite human. At one point, when we stopped to rest, Chris tried making noise to see if we could establish communication. The response was laughter. Not human laughter, but something that mimicked it, mocking and intelligent. We didn't stop again until we reached the cabin, and we didn't stay there long. We threw our essential gear in the truck and drove straight to the ranger station. Arriving around midnight, Patterson was there, like he'd been expecting us. "Where's your fourth man?" was the first thing he said. We told him everything: the photos, the bone arrangements, the hunting blind, Brad's death. He listened without interruption, taking notes and asking for copies of Chris's trail camera images. "I'll organize a search and recovery team for First Light," he said, "but I want you boys to go home now, and I want you to stay away from Copper Mountain. Permanently." "What the hell is up there?" Danny asked. Patterson was quiet for a long time. Finally, "Something that's been hunting humans a lot longer than humans have been hunting deer, and it's learned our methods well enough to turn them against us." The search team recovered Brad's body the next morning, but they never found Chris and Danny. The official report stated that they were presumed to have fallen into abandoned mine shafts while attempting to recover their friend's body. But I know better. I was there when Chris and Danny left the ranger station. I was there when they said they were going back up the mountain to get Brad and bring him home. I was also there when Patterson closed Copper Mountain Ridge to hunting permanently, citing unstable geological conditions and public safety concerns. That was 2 years ago. I still work third shift at the packaging plant, still live in Kentucky, still hunt every November. But I hunt different mountains now, and I never hunt alone. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in a tree stand in the early morning darkness, I remember the sound of that laughter echoing through the forest on Copper Mountain, and I remember Patterson's words about something that had been hunting humans longer than we'd been hunting deer. I think about Brad, Chris, and Danny every hunting season. I think about the tally marks carved into the rock beside that primitive hunting blind, and I wonder how many groups like ours had made the same mistake over the years. Most of all, I think about those photos on Chris's camera, the intelligence in their movement, the deliberate way they studied our equipment, the coordinated way they hunted us. Whatever lives on Copper Mountain Ridge, it's learned to hunt human hunters. And it's very, very good at it. I was 26 when I first heard about Lost Mountain from my granddad Bobby Jenkins, sitting on his back porch in the holler outside Knoxville. He was dying then, black lung from 40 years in the mines, and I guess he figured it was time to pass along some family business. I wasn't ready to hear. The mountain had been in our family since before the Civil War, he said, but nobody had lived up there in decades. There was a reason for that. Mountains got an arrangement. He wheezed between drags on his oxygen tank. Been that way since my great-granddad's time. You don't mess with what's up there, and it don't mess with you. I figured it was just old mountain superstition. Every holler in East Tennessee had stories about haunted ridges and creatures in the woods. But when Granddad died that winter, I inherited 200 acres of prime timber land that hadn't been touched in generations, and I needed the money bad. My construction business had gone under, my wife had left, and I was 3 months behind on rent. The land assessor said the timber alone was worth $60,000. All I had to do was clear some undergrowth and mark trees for the logging company. Simple work for a man who knew his way around a chainsaw. I should have listened to what Granddad tried to tell me. The first time I drove up that mountain road in March of 2018, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The forest was old-growth hardwood, oak and hickory trees thick as telephone poles, stretching up into a canopy so dense it blocked out most of the sky. Wildlife was everywhere. Deer stood in the road and barely moved when I honked. Fat rabbits grazed in clearings like they were somebody's livestock. I'd never seen animals so unafraid of humans. The old family homestead was still there, just a stone foundation and chimney covered in ivy. But the well was still good, and there was even an old logging road that went most of the way up the ridge. I figured I could clear and mark 50 trees a day, have the whole project done in 2 months, and walk away with enough money to get my life back on track. The work went smooth that first week. I'd drive up at dawn, work until mid-afternoon, then head back down before dark. The forest was peaceful in a way that made my chest tight. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just birdsong and wind in the trees. I'd forgotten how quiet the world could be. But there were sections of the property that didn't make sense. Areas where the trees were bigger and healthier than anywhere else, but the ground around them was disturbed, not by machinery, but by something else. Patches of earth that looked churned up like a giant rototiller had been through, except the pattern was wrong. Too organic, too random, and there were boundary markers I didn't remember from the property survey. Old stones stacked into cairns with animal skulls balanced on top, and strips of faded red cloth tied to trees in lines that seemed to divide the property into sections. When I asked at the county office, nobody knew what they were for. The land had been in my family so long that the original survey markers were lost. During the second week, I started finding the bones. Not scattered like you'd expect from natural predation, but piled. Stacked neat and clean in clearings throughout those restricted areas, sorted by type like inventory in some macabre warehouse. Deer skulls in one pile, leg bones in another, ribs arranged like cordwood, hundreds of animals represented, all stripped so clean they looked like museum specimens. But the fresh ones were what made my skin crawl. Bones still damp with marrow, dropped on top of piles that had clearly been there for years. Something was actively maintaining these sites, adding to them regular as clockwork. I started carrying my grandfather's. 30-06 after that. The sounds began that same week. At first, just rhythmic crunching from the direction of the bone piles, like someone cracking nuts with a hammer. I told myself it was bears or wild pigs. But bears don't work with that kind of precision. The sounds came in patterns. 3 quick cracks, pause. 5 quick cracks, pause, like signals. By the third week, I was hearing them every day. Not just crunching, but other sounds, wet sliding noises, like raw meat being dragged across stone. Click, click, clicking that sounded almost like Morse code. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating up through my boots when I got too close to the bone piles. I should have left then, should have called the logging company and told them to forget the whole deal. But $60,000 was $60,000, and I'd already cleared and marked about half the timber. I convinced myself I was being spooked by normal mountain sounds, amplified by isolation and too many horror movies. Then I found the handprints. They were pressed into the mud around one of the larger bone piles, clear as day in the soft earth after a night of rain. 4 fingers instead of 5, each one stretched out impossibly long and thin, like someone had taken a human hand and pulled it on a rack until all the proportions went wrong. The prints were huge, bigger than my own hands, bigger than any human hand I'd ever seen, and they were coated with some kind of greasy residue that caught the light like oil. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the prints led away from the bone pile in a perfect line, disappearing into what looked like a hole in the ground about 15 feet away. Not a cave or a natural depression, but a hole. Round and dark and deep enough that my flashlight beam couldn't find the bottom. I was staring into that hole, trying to work up the courage to get closer, when I heard the clicking behind me. Not the distant clicking I'd been hearing for days, but close. Right behind me, I turned around slow, keeping my rifle ready, and saw something that my brain refused to process for a full 10 seconds. It was crouched over a fresh deer carcass at the edge of the bone pile, maybe 20 feet away. Tall, 7 feet at least, but stretched out wrong, like a person-shaped balloon that had been inflated until all the proportions distorted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see dark shapes moving underneath that weren't organs or bones but something else entirely, something that pulsed and shifted like it was alive. The creature had its hands pressed against the deer's body, but it wasn't eating the way anything natural eats. Instead, the meat was just disappearing into its palms, absorbed directly through the skin. I watched the deer's flesh dissolve bit by bit, the creature's body swelling slightly as it fed, until nothing was left but clean white, bones that dropped to the ground with tiny clicking sounds. When it finished, it made a series of finger snaps in a complex pattern. Click, click, pause, click, 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 pause, and I heard answering clicks from the holes scattered around the clearing. Holes I hadn't noticed before, camouflaged by fallen leaves and undergrowth. More creatures emerged from underground burrows, all of them moving with purpose toward other carcasses I hadn't seen. Deer, rabbits, even what looked like a small bear, all lined up like they were cued for processing. The feeders worked together with supernatural efficiency, their finger clicking creating an intricate communication network that coordinated the entire operation. I realized I was looking at a colony, an organized society of feeding entities that had been living under Lost Mountain for God knows how long, maintaining territory and controlling the local ecosystem like farmers managing livestock. And I was standing right in the middle of their dinner service. The first creature that had been feeding suddenly stopped and turned its head toward me. It didn't have eyes like human eyes, just dark hollows where eyes should be, but I could feel it looking at me, studying me, deciding what I was and whether I belonged there. It clicked its fingers once, a single, sharp snap, and every other creature in the clearing froze and turned toward me with that same eyeless stare. I ran. Not the smart, careful retreat I should have made, but blind panic running, crashing through brush and jumping over fallen logs, my rifle forgotten somewhere behind me. Tree branches tore at my clothes and face as I fought my way back toward the logging road, the clicking sounds following me but never getting closer, like the feeders had decided I wasn't worth the energy to pursue. When I reached my truck, I was shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I drove down that mountain road faster than was safe, my mind reeling with what I'd seen. That night, I called my Uncle Ray, Granddad's younger brother who'd stayed in the holler after everyone else moved to town. Ray was 73 and sharp as a tack, and if anyone knew the real story about Lost Mountain, it would be him. "You been up to the feeding grounds?" he said when I described what I'd seen. It wasn't a question. The what? Feeding grounds. That's what Granddad called them, places where the mountain things do their business. Ray was quiet for a long time, and I could hear him lighting his pipe. "Bobby tried to tell you before he died, didn't he? About the arrangement? He said something about not messing with what's up there. That's putting it mild." Ray took a long draw on his pipe. "Our people made a deal with those things back in 1847, when your great-great-great-granddad was trying to homestead that ridge. Family's been honoring it ever since." "What kind of deal?" "Survival," Ray said simply. "Mountain was already occupied when our folks got there. Things that had been feeding on that ridge since before the Cherokee ever set foot in Tennessee. Your ancestor was smart enough to realize he couldn't fight them, so he negotiated." Ray explained the arrangement in the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used to describe crop rotation or livestock management. The feeders controlled certain sections of the mountain, the areas marked with red cloth and stone cairns, and the family controlled the rest. In exchange for territorial respect, the feeders eliminated dangerous wildlife, controlled the deer population, and kept other threats away from the homestead. "What kind of threats?" "Bears, mostly, wildcats, poisonous snakes, things that could kill settlers." Ray paused. "And people, strangers who might cause trouble. Thieves, claim, jumpers, revenuers. Feeders don't much care what kind of meat they process. The family's part of the arrangement was simple: provide livestock when requested, keep hunters and hikers away from feeding territories, and never ever interfere with the feeders' activities." "What happens if someone breaks the deal?" "Folks disappear," Ray said. "Clean bones turn up in the feeding grounds a few days later." I asked Ray why nobody had ever told me about this before, why it wasn't common knowledge in the family. "Because most folks can't handle it," he said. "Bobby's daddy tried to break the arrangement back in the 52nds. Thought he was smarter than his ancestors, tried to have the feeders driven off by bringing in exterminators and wildlife control. Lost 3 family members before he came to his senses. Bobby never forgot that. So what am I supposed to do now?" "I've already disturbed their territory." "Depends. Did they hurt you?" I realized they hadn't. The feeders could have killed me easily. I'd been standing in their feeding ground, unarmed and outnumbered, but they'd let me run away. "They were warning you," Ray said, "letting you know the Bolt rules. Now you got to decide whether you're going to honor the arrangement or not." "What if I just sell the land?" "Feeders don't recognize property sales," Ray said. "Far as they're concerned, the arrangement is with the Jenkins bloodline. It don't end until the bloodline ends." Over the next few days, I researched everything I could about Lost Mountain and our family history. What I found in old county records and family documents made my blood run cold. The Jenkins family had indeed prospered for generations, even during the worst economic times. Our homestead had never suffered a crop failure, lost livestock to predators, or had family members killed by wildlife. Statistical impossibilities for a mountain farming family in the 1800s and early 1900s. But there were also records of family members who disappeared without a trace. Always the ones who'd tried to break tradition, sell parts of the mountain, or bring outsiders onto the property. Their names were recorded in death certificates, but their bodies were never found. I also found my great-grandfather's journal, hidden in a trunk in Ray's attic. The entries from 1923 described the arrangement in chilling detail. Asterisk. Took old Bessie up to the north, feeding ground today. Tied her to the oak tree like always, and left water. Heard the feeding sound start before I was halfway down the mountain. Mountain folk don't like to be kept waiting. Asterisk. Asterisk. Tommy Morrison came around asking about hunting rights again. Told him property was off limits, but he wouldn't listen. Found his bones in the south, feeding ground 3 days later. Feeders left his rifle and boots stacked neat beside the pile, clean as a whistle. Message received. Asterisk. Asterisk. Arrangement keeps this family safe. Costs us maybe 2 head of cattle a year and some privacy, but we ain't lost a family member to accident or predator in 3 generations. Some prices are worth paying. Asterisk. The journal made it clear that the arrangement wasn't just about feeding creatures. The feeders controlled their territory absolutely, eliminating any threat to the established order. They'd killed wolves, bears, venomous snakes, and disease-carrying vermin that could threaten the homestead. They'd also eliminated human threats, criminals, hostile neighbors, government agents who got too curious about mountain business. In return, the family provided livestock, maintained secrecy, and respected territorial boundaries. It was a symbiotic relationship that had kept the Jenkins family alive and prosperous for over 150 years. Now it was my turn to decide whether to honor it. I drove back up the mountain the next morning, but this time I stopped at the boundaries marked by red cloth. I called out to the feeding grounds, feeling ridiculous, but remembering my great-grandfather's journal entries about proper protocol. "I'm Robert Jenkins," I shouted into the woods, "Bobby's grandson. I want to honor the Doc-Tech arrangement." The forest went dead silent. No birdsong, no wind, no insect noise, just absolute quiet that pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. Then I heard the clicking, soft at first, then growing louder as more voices joined in, until the whole forest was alive with the Gary sound of finger-snapping conversations I couldn't understand. The clicking went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. A single deer emerged from the feeding ground and walked slowly toward me. It was the biggest, healthiest deer I'd ever seen, probably 200 pounds, with a rack that would make any hunter weep with envy. The animal walked right up to me, close enough to touch, and stood there, looking at me with intelligent eyes that seemed far too aware. Then it turned and walked back into the feeding ground, stopping once to look over its shoulder, like it wanted me to follow. I understood. The feeders were showing me the local wildlife they controlled, demonstrating their ability to manage the ecosystem. The deer weren't wild animals anymore. They were livestock, bred and maintained by entities that had been perfecting predator-prey relationships since before recorded history. I also understood that the arrangement would continue whether I wanted it to or not. The feeders had been on Lost Mountain for centuries before my family arrived, and they'd be there for centuries after we were gone. The only question was whether the Jenkins family would continue to benefit from their protection or become just another food source. That weekend, I drove to a livestock auction in Sevierville and bought 2 young steers, good quality beef cattle that cost me most of my remaining savings. I loaded them into a borrowed trailer and drove them up the mountain to the main feeding ground. The steers went docile as soon as we crossed into feeder territory, standing calm and patient while I tied them to trees near the bone pile. I left water and hay, then drove back down the mountain without looking back. The feeding sound started before I was halfway home. The next morning, I found clean bones stacked neatly in the feeding ground, along with the ropes and empty water buckets. The feeders had left everything organized and tidy, ready for the next delivery. I also found something else, a deer carcass, freshly killed and dressed, hanging from a tree near the property line. Payment. The feeders were providing meat in exchange for the livestock I delivered, just like my ancestors had described. Over the following weeks, I finished marking trees in the areas the feeders allowed me to work. The logging company came and went, paying me $52,000 for timber rights that didn't include the feeding territories. I told them those areas had unstable soil and weren't safe for heavy equipment. Since then, I've maintained the arrangement exactly as my family did for 5 generations before me. Twice a year, I deliver livestock to the feeding grounds, usually cattle or pigs bought from local auctions. The feeders always provide payment in return. Fresh venison, wild turkey, sometimes even wild boar that's been perfectly processed and butchered. I've also taken over protecting the Both Mountain from outside interference. Hikers, hunters, and thrill seekers who ignore posted signs and try to explore feeding territories simply disappear. Their bones show up in the feeding grounds a few days later, clean and white, and added to piles that have been growing for over a century. The arrangement works because both sides honor it. The feeders get reliable access to fresh meat without having to compete with human hunters for wild game. My family gets protection from natural threats and economic stability in a region where both are rare commodities. I've learned to live with the knowledge that I'm essentially a livestock broker for entities that shouldn't exist. It's easier than you'd think once you accept that the normal rules don't apply on Lost Mountain. The feeders aren't evil, exactly. They're just efficient. They process meat with supernatural skill and maintain their territory with absolute ruthlessness, but they honor agreements and pay their debts. In some ways, they're more reliable partners than most humans I've dealt with. My nephew asked me last month about inheriting the mountain property. He's graduating college next year and needs money to start his own business. I told him we'd talk about it when he's ready to hear the whole story. Some traditions exist for reasons that go deeper than anyone living can remember. The feeders of Lost Mountain have been keeping their end of the bargain for over 150 years. As long as the Jenkins family keeps ours, we'll continue to prosper in ways that don't make sense to our neighbors. The mountain keeps its secrets, and so do we. That's how it's always been, and that's how it's going to stay. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can still hear the clicking from up on the ridge. The sound of ancient entities communicating in a language older than human speech, maintaining territories that existed before our ancestors ever dreamed of crossing the ocean. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear answering clicks from other mountains across the valley. Lost Mountain isn't the only place where arrangements have been made. There are other feeding grounds, other families who learn to coexist with things that don't belong in any normal world. The Appalachians are old mountains, worn down by time and weather until they're full of hidden places where ancient things still live. Most people drive through these hills and see nothing but trees and rocks, but if you know how to look, if you know what signs to watch for, you realize we're not alone out here. We never have been. I'm 29 now, teaching 3rd grade here in Asheville, but I still wake up some nights thinking about what happened in the summer of 2002 when I was 8 years old. My family used to visit my great-grandmother up in the Smoky Mountains every year, deep in what locals call the dark hollers of western North Carolina. Nana lived alone in a cabin that my great-great-grandfather built in the 1922, way up on Painter's Ridge, where the old Cherokee hunting trails still wind through woods so thick you can walk for miles without seeing sky. The mountain people have words for things that don't have names anywhere else. They call the deep woods the back of beyond, and the things that live there, things that aren't quite animal, aren't quite spirit, they call boogers. Not the silly kid word, but something older, meaner. Something that feeds on human longing and learns to wear the faces of the ones we love most. Nana's cabin sat on 10 acres that backed up against thousands of acres of national forest, connected to the outside world by a single dirt road that washed out every spring and froze solid every winter. No electricity, no running water, no cell towers for 30 miles in any direction. The nearest neighbor was old Ezra Hensley, about a mile down the ridge, and he'd lived there so long he remembered when the last Cherokee families were still hiding in those mountains, passing down warnings about things that shouldn't be disturbed. The cabin itself was built into the side of the mountain, with a root cellar that went back into the hillside and a stone foundation that used rocks older than recorded history. Great-great-grandfather had chosen the spot because of a natural spring, but Nana always said he'd really picked it because it was a thin place. Somewhere the veil between worlds wore fragile. She knew things about those mountains that weren't written in any books, knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that some places demand respect. That summer started different from all the others. Usually Nana would be waiting on her front porch when we pulled up, wearing one of her flower print dresses and the pearl necklace she'd inherited from her own grandmother. She'd hug us like we were the most precious things in creation, then spend the evening catching us up on mountain gossip and teaching me the names of wildflowers I'd forgotten since the summer before. But in 2002, she seemed diminished somehow, smaller, more fragile, like something was slowly draining her essence away. During our first dinner together, she called me Little Flower instead of Mountain Girl, the pet name she'd used for me since I could walk. When I brought her a bouquet of trilliums and bloodroot, she stared at them like she'd never seen wildflowers before, even though she'd taught me to identify those exact species when I was 5. My parents kept exchanging worried glances over my head. Mom's brother Jimmy, who worked as a paramedic down in Bryson City, pulled them aside that first night for whispered conversations about early onset and moving her closer to town. But I could see something in Nana's eyes that wasn't confusion or sickness. It was fear. On the second day, while my parents drove into town for supplies, Nana pulled me aside for one of our private talks. We sat on the porch steps overlooking the hollow, and she gripped my hands with surprising strength. "Amanda, honey," she said, using my real name instead of her usual endearment, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen with your whole heart." The way she said it made my stomach twist with dread. There's something in these woods that's been watching our family, watching me, specifically, learning me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. For weeks now, I've been having dreams about something studying how I move, how I talk, how I laugh. And sometimes when I look out toward the tree line at dusk, I can see my own face looking back at me from between the branches. She paused, studying my expression to make sure I was really listening. The old Cherokee had a name for creatures like this. They called them Nunahayenu, the hungry spirits that steal shape and memory. Your great-great-grandfather knew about them too, and that's why he built this cabin with iron nails and rowan wood, with salt lines and protective charms. But those protections only work if you know what you're looking for. I wanted to interrupt, to tell her she was scaring me. But something in her eyes kept me quiet. "The grown-ups think I'm just getting old and confused," she continued, "and maybe some of it is that, but I want you to remember something, just in case. These creatures, they can copy everything about a person, memories, mannerisms, even love, but they always get small things wrong. If you ever see Nana after I'm gone, honey, pay attention to the little details. The real me would never call you anything but Mountain Girl. The real me knows that bloodroot blooms before trillium, and that you take your cornbread with honey, not molasses. If those things are wrong, it won't really be me." That night, Nana's condition worsened dramatically. She developed a high fever and became delirious, mumbling about someone practicing being me in the mirror and getting the recipes wrong on purpose. She kept pointing toward the windows, claiming she could see her own reflection moving independently of her body, making gestures that were almost right but slightly off, like someone learning choreography from watching through glass. My parents assumed it was fever talking, but I remembered the Cherokee stories Nana had told me over the years. Stories about spirits that would watch a person for months, learning their patterns, waiting for the moment of weakness when they could slip into a life like putting on clothes that belonged to someone else. By the third day, Nana could barely stay conscious. Dr. Mackenzie drove up from town to check on her, but his medicine didn't seem to help. She kept getting weaker, like something was literally draining the life out of her. Uncle Jimmy wanted to take her to the hospital in Asheville, but she begged us not to. "I want to die in my own bed," she whispered, "in the house where I've been happy. Don't let them take me away from the mountain." On the morning of our 5th day there, just as the mist was lifting from the valleys below, Nana passed away peacefully with all of us around her. I'd never seen anyone die before, and it was both sadder and more natural than I'd expected. She just closed her eyes and stopped breathing, like she'd finally found the rest she'd been seeking. The funeral was held 2 days later at Painter's Ridge Baptist Church, a tiny, white building that had served the mountain community for over a century. It seemed like everyone from miles around came to pay their respects. Nana had lived on that ridge for 63 years and had helped birth babies, tend sick livestock, and preserve the old ways for generations of mountain families. After the service, we returned to the cabin for a traditional reception. The mountain women brought covered dishes and mason jars of preserves, and the men gathered on the porch to share stories about Nana's late husband and the old days when logging was still king in those hills. Slowly, the house filled with the kind of warm, living energy that had always made it feel magical to me, but I was exhausted from crying and from trying to process the finality of death. By 10 o'clock, most of the visitors had gone home down the winding mountain roads, and our family was getting ready for bed. I was lying in the little room that had been my mother's when she was growing up, listening to my relatives moving quietly through the house, when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was the distinctive creak of Nana's rocking chair on the front porch. A sound I'd heard every night of every visit since I was a baby. The rhythm was exactly right. Rock forward, pause, rock back, pause. The same gentle tempo Nana had used when she'd rock me to sleep as a toddler. At first, I figured it was one of the adults who couldn't sleep, maybe sitting outside to grieve in private. The idea of joining them, of sharing some of my own sadness, seemed comforting. So I slipped out of bed and tiptoed through the dark house toward the front door. The screen door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see the silhouette of someone sitting in Nana's chair, rocking slowly back and forth. The figure was the right size and shape, wearing what looked like a familiar dress. Moonlight caught the gleam of pearls at her throat, but when I pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch, every instinct I possessed started screaming warnings. It was Nana sitting there, looking exactly as she had in life. Same silver hair pinned back in a neat bun, same kind eyes, same gentle smile. She was wearing her favorite blue dress with the tiny flowers, the one we'd buried her in just that afternoon. For a split second, my heart soared with impossible joy. Somehow, miraculously, she'd come back to me. "Come here, little flower," she said, holding out her arms with the exact gesture she'd made thousands of times before. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that this thing was not my grandmother. Nana had never called me little flower, except during that confused period when she was dying. I was always her mountain girl, always. But this creature was using the wrong name, the name she'd used when something else was already influencing her mind. I stood frozen on the porch, studying her more carefully. Physically, she looked perfect. Every wrinkle was in the right place, every age spot correctly positioned. But something about her movements was wrong, like someone had studied Nana's behavior in great detail, but was having to consciously remember each gesture instead of making them naturally. Her breathing was too regular, her blinking too measured. When she smiled, all the right muscles moved in all the right ways, but the timing was just slightly off, like watching a video with the audio not quite synced. And her eyes? When the moonlight hit them at certain angles, they reflected like a nocturnal animal's. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, standing up from the chair. The movement was eerily perfect but somehow mechanical, like a sophisticated puppet being controlled by someone who understood the motions but not the soul behind them. "Come, give your Nana a hug." Before I could back toward the door, I heard my parents' voices coming from inside the house. They'd heard me moving around and come to investigate. When they saw what they thought was their mother standing on the porch, alive and well, their faces went through a cascade of emotions. Shock, disbelief, hope, and desperate joy. "Mom?" my mother whispered, her voice breaking. "But we buried you. How are you here?" The thing wearing Nana's face turned that practiced smile toward my parents. "I got better, dear. I feel much better now." The voice was perfect. Same tone, same slight mountain accent, same warm inflection. But the words were wrong. Nana would have said something more characteristic, would have made a joke or referenced a family story. Incredibly, my parents believed her. They were so desperate to have their mother back, so willing to accept a miracle, that they didn't notice the subtle wrongness I could see clearly. They rushed forward to embrace her, crying and laughing, talking about comas and misdiagnosis and answered prayers. The creature accepted their hugs with careful precision, but I watched how it studied their faces while they weren't looking, like it was memorizing their reactions for future reference. It was learning them too, I realized. building a catalog of how each family member responded to affection, storing information for whatever came next. Over the following days, while the adults made frantic phone calls to the funeral home and tried to understand what had happened, I observed this imposter with growing horror. Its knowledge of our family was unnaturally complete. It could recall conversations from decades past with perfect accuracy, knew recipes that had never been written down, could sing mountain ballads in the exact way Nana had learned them from her own grandmother. But it consistently made small, telling errors. It called the pileated woodpecker that nested near the cabin a red-headed woodpecker. It put sugar in coffee that Nana had always taken black. It told a story about my grandfather that was accurate in every detail, except it placed the events in the wrong season. These weren't random mistakes. They felt deliberate, like something was testing whether anyone would notice the differences. Most disturbing was how it focused on me. Every conversation seemed designed to isolate me from the rest of the family. It offered to teach me special mountain secrets that we could share privately. It suggested walks deep into the woods, just the two of us, to visit places Nana had never shown me before. It asked detailed questions about my friends at home, my favorite hiding places, my deepest fears. The kind of information something might need if it planned to replace me next. When I tried to explain my concerns to the adults, they dismissed my fears as grief-related trauma. It's normal for children to have difficulty accepting major changes, Mom explained to Dad when they thought I couldn't hear. She's probably afraid of losing her grandmother again. But that wasn't it at all. I wasn't afraid of losing Nana. I was afraid of the hungry thing that had stolen her face and was now learning to steal ours. On our last night at the cabin, I couldn't bear the charade anymore. While everyone else was packing and making plans to bring Nana home with us, I snuck into her bedroom to search for evidence of what had really happened to her. The room looked exactly as it always had, quilts folded neatly, precious, belongings arranged on the dresser, the smell of lavender sachets in the drawers. But something made me examine the space more carefully. Maybe it was the way the creature had avoided this room, or the way it had deflected suggestions that it sleep in its own bed. I started looking in places I'd never explored before, behind the dresser, under the bed, in the corners where shadows gathered thickest. That's when I found the loose floorboard near the window, partially hidden by the edge of an old braided rug. When I pried it up with my fingernails, I discovered a small cavity that had been deliberately hollowed out, and inside that space, wrapped in one of Nana's own quilts, were human remains. The bones were old and yellowed, but still held together by desiccated tissue and scraps of a blue-flowered dress. A tarnished pearl necklace lay coiled among the ribs like a blue snake. These were Nana's real remains, hidden away while something else had taken her place weeks before we'd even arrived for our visit. I understood then why she'd seemed so confused and frightened during our stay. The real Nana had been dying slowly while this creature studied her, learning her mannerisms and memories through some supernatural osmosis. By the time we arrived, it had been ready to make the switch, using Nana's final illness as cover for the transition. I ran to find Uncle Jimmy, who was loading boxes into his truck. When I dragged him back to show him what I'd found, the look on his face told me everything. He believed me now. He could see the physical evidence of deception that no grief-induced hallucination could explain. Together, we gathered my parents and confronted the thing that had been pretending to be their mother. When faced with the reality of Nana's bones, carefully hidden like a spider's stored prey, the creature's facade finally cracked. The transformation was hideous and gradual. First, its face began to elongate, the features stretching like warm wax. The skin grew pale and waxy, taking on a sickly, translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath. Its limbs extended unnaturally, becoming spider-thin and impossibly long. The beautiful silver hair fell out in clumps, revealing a skull covered in rough, bark-like skin. But worst of all was the sound it made, a shriek that was part wounded animal, part tree, branch scraping against glass, and part something else entirely, something that spoke to the deepest, most primitive fears buried in human DNA. It was the sound of hunger that could never be satisfied, of intelligence that viewed humans as nothing more than clothing to be worn and discarded. The creature that had called itself Nana fled toward the woods on its distorted limbs, moving with inhuman speed and agility. We could hear it crashing through the underbrush for hours afterward, occasionally releasing that terrible cry that echoed off the mountain ridges like a wound in the night itself. We left at dawn and never returned. Uncle Jimmy made some calls to the local sheriff's department, but what could we tell them? That something from Cherokee folklore had murdered and replaced our grandmother? Instead, we let the official record show that Nana had died peacefully and been buried properly. We sold the cabin to developers from Florida who probably bulldozed it to build vacation condos, never knowing what had happened there. But I learned later, through careful research into local newspapers and historical records, that the Painters Ridge area had a long history of disappearances and strange sightings. Cherokee oral histories spoke of hungry spirits that dwelt in the deepest hollows, creatures that fed on human memory and emotion. Early white settlers had reported family members returning from the dead with subtle but disturbing differences in personality. Even as recently as the 1972nd, there were newspaper accounts of miraculous recoveries that later proved to be elaborate hoaxes, though investigators could never determine who the hoaxers were or how they'd gained such intimate knowledge of the protected deceased. I'm 31 now, and I've never told anyone the complete story until today. Who would believe it? But it taught me something crucial about trusting instincts. Even when the adults around you refuse to see obvious truths, sometimes children perceive things that grown-ups filter out through logic and wishful thinking. Sometimes the thing that looks most familiar is actually the most dangerous. I still miss my real Nana every day, but I'm grateful she found a way to warn me during her final lucid moments. Grateful she taught me to pay attention to small details that reveal large deceptions. That knowledge has served me well. As a teacher, children can't fool me with lies, because I learned early how to spot the subtle signs when someone is pretending to be something they're not. But sometimes, on foggy mornings, when the mist hangs low in the valleys around Asheville, I catch myself scanning the tree line for faces that shouldn't be there. And sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there in the deep hollers, still hungry, still watching, still learning to wear the faces of people other families love most. If you ever find yourself in the mountains of western North Carolina, pay attention to the old warnings. Trust the stories the mountain people tell, even if they sound like superstition. And if someone you've lost comes back to you, no matter how perfect they seem, check the small details first. Because some hungers never die, they just learn to hide behind the faces of the ones we can't bear to lose. My name is Dolores Stewart, though most folks around here just call me Dolly. I'm 71 now, been living in these Kentucky hills my whole life, and I've got a story that's been eating at me for 60 years. It's about faith, about family, and about something that happened up in the Tennessee mountains that changed everything I thought I knew about the price of miracles. See, I was born with what my granny called the sight. Not anything dramatic like you see in movies, but more like a persistent itch in the back of my mind when something wasn't right. Made me a skeptical child, always, questioning things that other folks took on faith. My mama used to say I had too much of my daddy's stubborn streak and not enough of her trusting heart. Looking back now, I think that stubborn streak is what saved my brother's soul. This all started in 1965, when I was 13 and my little brother Tommy was 8. Tommy had been born with a clubfoot so severe that 3 different doctors told my parents surgery wouldn't help. His right foot was twisted inward and backward, making every step a struggle. In our little mining town, where a man's ability to work determined his family's survival, watching your boy limp through childhood was heartbreak served daily. Daddy worked double shifts at the Cumberland mine, coming home black with coal dust and exhaustion, but the medical bills were drowning us anyway. Mama took in sewing and sold vegetables from our garden, but it wasn't enough. By 1965, hope was becoming a luxury we couldn't afford. That's when Aunt Verna came down from Virginia with news about Brother Elijah. Verna was my mama's younger sister, the kind of woman who chased every traveling preacher and faith healer between Kentucky and Georgia. She'd drag her family to tent revivals and healing services, always convinced that the next miracle was just one prayer away. Most of us had learned to nod politely when Verna started talking about signs and wonders, but this time was different. This time, Verna wasn't excited or breathless with religious fervor. She was serious, almost frightened, in a way I'd never seen her before. "This ain't like the others," she told Mama over coffee at our kitchen table. "This brother Elijah, he's the real thing. I seen him heal a paralyzed woman in Beckley. Watched her stand up and walk, right out of that wheelchair like she'd never been sick a day in her life. Verna, you know how these things go," Mama said gently. "People get caught up in the moment, think they're healed, but no," Verna's voice was sharp. "I talked to that woman's daughter afterward," said her mama. "Had been paralyzed for 15 years from a car accident. Doctors said the spinal cord was completely severed. But she walked out of there, Lucy. Walked out carrying that wheelchair over her shoulder." The conversation continued, but I was studying Verna's face. She looked older than when I'd last seen her, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. And there was something in her eyes. Not doubt, exactly, but a kind of troubled confusion, like she'd seen something wonderful and terrible at the same time. Over the next few days, Mama couldn't stop thinking about what Verna had said. She started asking around, and the stories she heard all pointed to the same thing. Brother Elijah's 3-day revival at Salvation Ridge was drawing desperate families from 6 states. People were taking time off work they couldn't afford to lose, spending money they didn't have, all for a chance at what the advertisements called genuine biblical healing for true believers. Daddy was skeptical, naturally. He'd been raised in a Baptist church where miracles were something you read about in Sunday school, not something that happened to coal miners in Kentucky. But when you're watching your youngest boy struggle every day, when the doctors have given up and your savings are gone, skepticism becomes a luxury you can't maintain. The decision came when Mrs. Henderson from down the hollow stopped by. Her grandson had been born with a withered arm, and she'd heard about families selling everything they owned to get to Salvation Ridge. The desperation in her voice, the way she clutched Mama's hand while talking about it, that's when I first felt that familiar itch in the back of my mind. Something wasn't right about this whole thing, but Daddy had made up his mind. "We've tried everything else," he said. "Doctors, specialists, even took him to that hospital in Louisville. If there's a chance, even a small one, we gotta take it." So he scraped together enough money for gas and a cheap motel, and we loaded up our old Plymouth for the drive to Tennessee. Verna and her family followed in their pickup truck, making a little convoy of desperate hope, winding through mountain roads that got narrower and more treacherous the farther south we went. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would build a tabernacle so far from civilization. The last 40 miles were on gravel roads that barely fit 2 cars, with steep drop-offs on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. There were no signs, no advertisements, just a hand-painted board every few miles with an arrow and the words, Salvation Ridge. 15 miles, or Salvation Ridge, 8 miles. When we finally reached the site, I understood the isolation was deliberate. The tabernacle sat in a natural bowl between 3 mountains, completely hidden from the outside world. It was a massive wooden structure with a tin roof and no walls, open to the possible mountain air on all sides. Around it, families had set up camps in the surrounding woods, some in tents, others just sleeping in their cars. License plates from Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, even a few from Georgia and South Carolina. The whole place hummed with nervous energy and desperate hope. Parents clutched their afflicted children a little too tight. Husbands and wives spoke in hushed, urgent whispers, and everyone seemed to move with the careful deliberation of people walking on sacred ground. Tommy was exhausted from the long ride, but his eyes went wide when he saw all the other children. There were kids everywhere, some clearly healthy siblings along for the trip, but many others dealing with their own ailments. I saw children with leg braces, thick glasses, hearing aids, crutches. One little girl, couldn't have been more than 6, sat in a wheelchair pushed by parents who looked like they'd aged 20 years in the stress of caring for her. Mama explained that my job was to help watch the younger children during the main services. The healing ceremonies were primarily for teenagers and adults, but families needed somewhere safe for their little ones. It was a responsibility I took seriously, but it also gave me the perfect vantage point to observe what was happening in that tabernacle. And what I observed, starting that very first night, began to explain the itch in the back of my mind. The singing, was beautiful. I'll give them that. Over 1,200 voices raised together, harmonies that seemed to echo off the mountain ridges and come back stronger. Brother Elijah didn't appear until nearly midnight. But when he finally walked onto that platform, the entire crowd fell silent like someone had thrown a switch. He was exactly what you'd expect from a traveling preacher, and nothing like what you'd expect at the same time. Tall and thin, with silver hair that caught the lantern light and pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. His voice was smooth and cultured, not the fire and brimstone shouting I'd heard at other revivals. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, but somehow every word carried to the back of that open-air structure. But it was the way people responded to him that made my skin crawl. The moment he started speaking, everyone in that crowd began swaying slightly, almost in unison. Their eyes took on a glassy, unfocused look, like they were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. And then the healings began. A man who'd been carried in on a stretcher stood up and walked. A woman who'd been led to the platform by her daughter suddenly threw off her thick glasses and read from a Bible held 20 feet away. A teenager with a withered arm watched it grow strong and straight under Brother Elijah's touch. The crowd went wild each time, shouting and praising God, but the healed people themselves. That's what bothered me. They should have been ecstatic, overwhelmed with joy and gratitude. Instead, they looked confused, almost empty, like they were sleepwalking through their own miracles. I watched the man who'd been paralyzed as his wife rushed to embrace him, tears streaming down her face. But he just stood there, staring at Brother Elijah like he was waiting for permission to feel something. When she called his name, he looked at her like he wasn't quite sure who she was. That night, back at our motel room, I tried to tell Mama what I'd observed, but she shushed me quickly. "Don't you go speaking doubt about God's work," she warned. That's exactly the kind of faithlessness that could keep Tommy from getting his healing. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. And the next day, when I had a chance to talk to some of the families whose loved ones had been healed, my suspicions deepened. The paralyzed man's wife was trying to have a normal conversation with her husband, but he kept giving strange answers. When she mentioned their anniversary, he looked blank. When she talked about their grandchildren, he acted like he'd never heard of them. All he wanted to discuss was Brother Elijah, the revival, bringing more people to experience the healing power. The woman who'd regained her sight was having similar problems. Her daughter kept trying to remind her of shared memories, family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. But the woman responded to everything with the same vacant smile and religious platitudes about divine healing and spreading the word. It was like the healing had fixed their bodies, but erased their personalities. The second night, I positioned myself where I could observe the ceremonies more closely. Mama and Daddy were too focused on preparing Tommy for his healing to pay much attention to where I was, and the other adults were caught up in the fervor of the services. What I saw that night confirmed my worst fears. Brother Elijah would call people forward, one at a time, place his hands on them, and they'd collapse like they'd been struck by lightning. When they stood back up, their physical ailments were gone, but something else was missing too. Something essential. The healed people from the previous night were all there, standing in a group near the platform. They moved with an eerie synchronization, turning their heads at the same time, nodding in perfect unison when Brother Elijah spoke. When someone in the crowd called out to one of them, they'd respond with the same empty smile and religious phrases, like they were all reading from the same script. But it was their eyes that really frightened me. Glassy and unfocused, like they were looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. Or like they weren't really looking at anything at all. I decided I needed to understand what was really happening here. During the day, while the adults attended prayer, sessions and testimony meetings, I explored the area around the tabernacle. That's when I found the entrance to the space beneath the platform. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't advertised either. A wooden door, built into the hillside, partially concealed by mountain laurel bushes. The door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning, but my curiosity was stronger than my caution. Inside, I found a natural cave that had been expanded and reinforced with timber supports. It ran directly under the tabernacle platform, with several smaller chambers branching off, the main tunnel. And in the largest of these chambers, I discovered Brother Elijah's real operation. He was there with about 40 of his healed followers, and they were The word praying doesn't do justice to what I witnessed. They were chanting in perfect unison, their voices creating a low, hypnotic drone that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. The words weren't English, maybe not any human language at all, but what I could see happening to Brother Elijah made my blood turn to ice. As they chanted, streams of golden light flowed from each of the healed people into him. Not visible light exactly, I don't think anyone without the sight could have seen it, but energy, life force, the essence of who they had been. With each pulse of energy, Brother Elijah looked younger, stronger, more vital. The healed people, meanwhile, grew paler and more vacant with every passing minute. I understood then that Brother Elijah wasn't healing anyone. He was a parasite, using the promise of healing to lure in victims whose life force he could steal. The physical healings were real, but they were just bait for a trap that cost people their souls. I backed away from that chamber as quietly as I could and ran to find my parents. But they were so caught up in the revival atmosphere that they wouldn't listen to my warnings. When I tried to explain what I'd seen, they accused me of being jealous that Tommy was getting attention while I wasn't. The devil works hardest to create doubt when God's about to work a miracle, Mama said. You need to pray for forgiveness and faith. That evening, the final night of the revival, I made one last desperate attempt to convince them not to take Tommy forward. I begged them to leave, to take him to doctors in Louisville or Lexington, anywhere but that platform. But Daddy's mind was made up. We've come this far, he said. We've spent the money and made the trip. Tommy's going to get his healing tonight, and that's final. So I did the only thing I could think of. When the ceremony began and families started bringing their children forward for healing, I slipped away and crawled back into that cave system. If I couldn't stop what was about to happen to Tommy, at least I could witness it. Maybe find some way to help him afterward. The chamber beneath the platform was packed now with over 60 healed followers, their chanting so intense that dust was falling from the ceiling. Brother Elijah stood in the center of the energy streams, looking like a man in his 30s despite what Verna had told us about his decades of preaching. Then I heard Tommy's name, called. Through cracks in the floorboards above, I watched my parents carry my little brother to the platform. He looked so small and scared up there, his twisted foot making him lean against Daddy's leg for support. Brother Elijah knelt down and placed his hands on Tommy's shoulders, and I felt the energy in the chamber intensified dramatically. Tommy's foot began to straighten, the twisted bones and muscles realigning themselves in ways that defied medical explanation. But I could also see the light in his bright blue eyes starting to dim, that spark of personality that made him uniquely Tommy beginning to fade. No, I whispered, and then louder. No! Brother Elijah's head snapped toward my hiding place, those pale eyes seeming to look right through the floorboards. He gestured to several of his followers, and I heard footsteps heading for the cave entrance. But something else was happening. My shouted protest had broken Tommy's trance, just enough for him to look around in confusion. The healing energy faltered, and in that moment of uncertainty, I saw my real brother looking back at me. "Dolly?" he called out. "Dolly, where are you? Something's wrong." That's when I understood why I had the sight, why I'd always been skeptical of things other people accepted on faith. It wasn't just stubbornness or contrariness. It was protection, a natural immunity to supernatural manipulation that some people are born with. And in that moment, I realized I might be able to extend that protection to Tommy. I burst up through the floorboards in an explosion of splinters and dust, not caring about the shocked gasps from the crowd or the fury in Brother Elijah's eyes. "Leave my brother alone," I screamed, throwing myself between Tommy and the retweet preacher. Brother Elijah grabbed my shoulders, and the moment his hands touched me, I felt something trying to invade my mind. It was like ice water flooding my thoughts, attempting to wash away everything that made me who I was. But I held on to my memories, Tommy's laughter as he chased fireflies in our yard, his off-key singing along to the radio, the way he always got back up when he fell down. I wrapped those memories around my core self like armor. The psychic attack hit that armor and shattered like glass against stone. The feedback was immediate and devastating. Brother Elijah staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck, his youthful appearance aging rapidly as stolen energy drained away from him. All around the tabernacle, the healed followers suddenly stopped their synchronized movements, confusion returning to their faces as their real personalities reasserted themselves. "Margaret?" I heard a man call out to his wife, his voice full of relief and confusion. "Margaret, what happened? Where are we?" "Grandma," a young voice cried as the woman who'd forgotten her grandchildren suddenly remembered their names. "Grandma, you're talking like yourself again." Brother Elijah made one final attempt to regain control, raising his hands and shouting words in that inhuman language I'd heard in the cave. But his power was broken, the psychic network that had sustained him severed by my resistance. Tommy's foot remained perfectly straight and strong, the physical healing held, but the light returned to his eyes completely as he broke free from the supernatural influence. "Dolly," he cried, wrapping his arms around me. "I could hear you calling me, but I couldn't move." It was like being trapped in a bad dream. Around us, chaos erupted as people began demanding answers, some getting angry as they realized what had been done to them and their loved ones. But Brother Elijah was already backing toward the edge of the platform, his appearance continuing to deteriorate as more and more of his stolen vitality drained away. "You have no idea what you've done, child," he hissed, his voice now cracked and ancient. "Do you think this is the only flock? Do you think I haven't built others?" And then he was gone. Not vanished in a puff of smoke like something out of a fairy tale, but moved with inhuman speed into the darkness beyond the lanterns. Some people claimed they saw him dissolve into shadow, others swore he simply ran into the woods. All I know is that when we searched for him, we found nothing but his discarded preacher's coat hanging from a tree branch. The tabernacle burned that night. Lightning strike, the fire department said, when they finally made it up those mountain roads, though the sky had been clear. By dawn, there was nothing left but charred timber and scattered ashes. We drove home the next morning, Tommy walking normally for the first time in his life. He stayed healed, completely and permanently healed, and grew up to be a strong, healthy man who worked construction until his heart gave out at 68. But more importantly, he stayed himself. His sense of humor, his stubborn streak, his love for music and laughter, everything that made him Tommy remained intact. Most of the other families went home and never spoke of what happened at Salvation Ridge. There was an unspoken agreement to be grateful for the healings and forget about the rest. Some, like Verna, developed what she called religious doubts and never set foot in another revival meeting. Others threw themselves even deeper into their faith, as if determined to prove that their experience had been purely divine. But I couldn't forget. I'd seen too much, understood too clearly what Brother Elijah really was and what he'd been trying to do. It took me 2 years to piece together the full scope of his operation. I spent countless hours in libraries, reading old newspapers and tracking down stories about traveling preachers and miraculous healings. What I found convinced me that Brother Elijah, whatever his real name might have been, had been operating for decades, maybe longer. There were reports going back to the 1,920 seconds of similar revivals in remote locations. Always the same pattern: 3 days of services, miraculous healings, and then communities of strangely devoted followers who would work without payment and obey without question. The followers would eventually disappear, spreading out across the country to start new congregations, bringing more victims to subsequent revivals. I found obituaries of people who had attended these revivals and died within months, not from any physical ailment, but from what doctors described as a mysterious wasting condition, like their life force had simply run out. I found records of families torn apart when loved ones abandoned them to follow the preacher, becoming hollow shells of their former selves. And I found evidence that Brother Elijah's operation was far larger than anyone suspected. The followers he created didn't just vanish, they became recruiters, spreading out to identify new victims and establish the groundwork for future revivals. They ran seemingly legitimate churches and healing ministries, but their real purpose was to create networks of vulnerable people who could be delivered to their master when the time was right. The psychological damage to our family was severe and long-lasting. Mama never forgave herself for almost sacrificing Tommy's soul for his healing. She became obsessively protective, refusing to let any of us attend revivals or healing services, and she developed a deep distrust of any religious leader who promised miraculous cures. Daddy withdrew into himself, haunted by how close he'd come to losing his son in a way far worse than physical disability. He started drinking more, working longer hours, anything to avoid thinking about what had happened. It took years of family conversations and patient healing before he could talk about that night without his hands shaking. Tommy handled it better than any of us, maybe because he was young enough to adapt, but he never forgot the sensation of being trapped in his own mind, and he developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was being manipulative or dishonest. That feeling, like at Salvation Ridge, he'd call it, and he was never wrong. As for me, the experience changed everything about how I saw the world. The sight that had protected us became stronger, more focused. I could sense supernatural predators the way some people can smell gas leaks. An immediate, visceral warning that something dangerous was nearby. I used that ability throughout my life, quietly steering people away from situations and individuals that felt wrong. I became the school bus driver, partly because it let me keep an eye on local children, watching for signs of the kind of exploitation that thrives on innocence and desperation. I never married, never had children of my own. The responsibility of protecting others felt too important, and I worried that my own family would become targets if Brother Elijah or his followers ever came looking for revenge, because I was never entirely convinced he was gone for good. Over the years, I've continued tracking reports of similar revivals and mysterious healing services. The patterns are always the same, just updated for modern times. Televangelists who promise miracle cures in exchange for financial seed money. Online healing ministries that require participants to submit detailed personal information. Retreat centers in remote locations where people go, seeking spiritual renewal and return. Changed. 3 times in the past 60 years, I've felt that familiar itch in the back of my mind and followed it to situations where I could intervene. Twice, I was able to expose fraudulent operations before they could do serious harm. Once, in 1987, I encountered something so similar to what happened at Salvation Ridge that I'm convinced it was either Brother Elijah himself or one of his original disciples, still operating after all those years. That encounter was difficult. The entity was stronger, more experienced, and it nearly succeeded in breaking through my defenses. I survived, but just barely, and several people weren't so fortunate. The official story blamed a carbon monoxide leak for the deaths and the survivors' memory problems. But I knew better. I'm sharing this story now because I'm 71 years old, and the sight is fading as my mind and body age. Soon, there won't be anyone left who remembers what really happened at Salvation Ridge, or who knows how to recognize the signs when something like Brother Elijah surfaces again. And I'm certain something like him will surface again. There are always people desperate enough to pay any price for healing. And there are always predators willing to exploit that desperation. The methods change, the technology advances, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. False hope used to steal something far more precious than money. If you ever find yourself tempted by promises of miraculous healing, especially if they require you to travel to remote locations or cut yourself off from family and friends, remember Tommy's story. Remember that real healing doesn't cost you your soul, doesn't leave you empty or changed into something you're not. And remember that sometimes the most important miracles are the ones we walk away from. The darkness in these mountains is deeper and older than most people realize. It feeds on faith and desperation, and it's always hungry. But it can be resisted if you're stubborn enough and love someone more than you fear the unknown. That's the lesson I learned at Salvation Ridge 60 years ago, and it's the warning I'm passing on to anyone willing to listen. Some prices are too high to pay, even for miracles. Especially for miracles.